It took me many years to finally decide on a topic for a TEDx talk. You may be surprised to see, or not, that it's about ADHD and much more. Please join me at ysquirrels.com/TEDx right now. Watch the video, leave a comment, like it, and please, if you find it helpful, and I think you will, please share it. Together we can spread this good idea. Thank you. Welcome to Wise Squirrels, the podcast for late diagnosed adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Dave Delaney. And if this is your first time listening, welcome to Wise Squirrels. I'm thrilled to have you here. And if you're a returning player, well, welcome back. It's great to have you back. How's that for an intro? I've reached 3 big milestones recently I wanted to share with you. The first being the most important, which is yesterday was my 25th wedding anniversary to my lovely wife and partner and friend, Heather. Happy anniversary, Heather. We've been together for 28 years, I guess, and married 25. And we met back in Galway, Ireland, back in 1998. And I mention that because it only took us 25 years to get back to Ireland just last week. And we were able to bring our kids, who are now 19 and 20, to show them where we met and all that good stuff. And it was super cool to catch up with NASA and her family. And I'm really, really ready already to get back again. I love Ireland so much. Okay, that's the first one. The second one, well, that was actually 2. That was 2 milestones in one. There you go, 2 for 1. The third milestone, I also celebrated 6 years sobriety, 6 years of not drinking alcohol. And I'm feeling very proud of myself for that. It hasn't been as hard as I thought it would be, especially having just been back to Ireland. Thank God they now have Guinness Zero. So yeah, so those are some milestones. How are you doing? How's things? How's life? You know, you can reach out to me. Visit ysquirrels.com. That's how you'll do that. You know, for decades, we've been told a very specific story about ADHD, that it's a childhood disorder and that it mostly affects those hyperactive boys. I know I was one of them. But the science has fundamentally shifted, and the reality for millions of adults, especially women, it's far more complex, especially when it's underdiagnosed and misunderstood. So today on the show, I'm thrilled to be getting a masterclass in the truth about adult neurodivergence from one of the foremost experts in the world, Dr. Maggie Sibley. Maggie is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine. She's a clinical psychologist at Seattle Children's Hospital, and her groundbreaking research has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. And get this, she has authored over 130 scholarly publications, all on ADHD. Maggie also serves on the professional advisory board for CHAD, and she is currently chairing the task force behind the highly anticipated forthcoming APSARD, Adult ADHD Diagnostic Guidelines. And that'll be dropping later this year. In this episode, we answer 3 big critical questions. First, what are the ADHD diagnosis red flags? These are things you must look out for to protect yourself and your loved ones from, rushed predatory evaluations. The second is, how do hidden gender differences cause adult symptoms to mask internally? And finally, what is the critical hormonal link between estrogen and dopamine that completely rewrites how women experience executive dysfunction across their lifespan? Pretty interesting topics to cover today. Do you ever feel like your brain is running a marathon just trying to track everything you're doing? You've got half-finished emails, unread Slack messages, a dozen or more open tabs, and you have action items from a meeting that you can barely recall. Managing your workflow shouldn't take more energy than the actual work does. And that's exactly why I'm excited to talk about our sponsor, Littlebird. Littlebird is an AI assistant designed to actually understand your context. And what it does is it securely builds a private memory based on your screen activity and your meetings. That means that when you need to dig up a specific detail, seamlessly jump back into a project, or draft an email that actually sounds like you, Littlebird is already fully up to speed. So you don't have to waste time typing out massive prompts, copy and pasting information, or re-explaining things to your AI every single time you use it. And security-wise, they've got you covered. SOC 2 certified for top-tier security, your data is never used to train models, and you have total control to pause or delete your history at any time. Right now, Wise Squirrels listeners can grab a free trial, and you can get $20 off your first month of Littlebird Plus. Just head over to try Littlebird at wisesquirrels.com/Littlebird. And we thank Littlebird for their sponsorship of Wise Squirrels. You know, ADHD shows up in so many different ways. For some of us, the main struggle is focusing and procrastination. For others, it's constant emotional overwhelm and impulsivity, or that nagging feeling of always falling behind. I know that feeling. Whatever it looks like for you, it can be a lot to figure out on your own. And that's why I'm excited to share that Inflow is back sponsoring Wise Squirrels. Inflow was made by people who understand this firsthand. And Inflow was co-founded by Dr. George Sachs, a clinical psychologist who specializes in ADHD. He spent 15 plus years supporting people with it, and he has ADHD too. Go Wise Squirrel. He built Inflow to help you understand how ADHD actually shows up in your own life. And then he points you towards support that fits. A good place to start is Inflow's free ADHD traits quiz. You'll get personalized insights into how those traits might be playing out for you and what kind of support could help. And from there, Inflow points you to the right next step. Visit wisesquirrels.com/inflow, take that free quiz, and you're going to be in good hands with Inflow. And we thank Inflow. And now, without further ado, here's Maggie.
My name is Maggie Sibley. I am a clinical psychologist in Seattle, Washington. I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington School of Medicine. I do some clinical work at Seattle Children's Hospital, and I do a lot of advocacy work in the ADHD space as well. So I'm involved in helping advise different organizations on their policies and their activities related to ADHD. So kind of pop around the ADHD space. I've been doing this line of work for about 20 years. So ever since I got out of grad school, this has kind of been the space that I've been really at home in, and I've been enjoying it.
What made ADHD a topic of interest for you?
I went to grad school with this interest in mental health that came from having several family members with mental health issues that I felt the impact of their experiences, but I didn't have a sense of like if there would be any specialty area for me. But when I got to grad school, the first placement I was put in was helping out in an after school program with a bunch of middle school boys who had ADHD. And I had the most fun with them, I think, of any clinical experience I ever had. And I realized that this is such an under-recognized group of folks where all you ever heard was how people with ADHD bother others. And yet there was so much joy and like promise and potential in these kids. And I just saw this like path that like there's so much work to be done to sort of like clarify what ADHD is and help people with ADHD walk through the world, that it just felt like a calling to me that, you know, I always say ADHD kind of found me, and I've just really enjoyed the work ever since.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. And, you know, I was one of those boys. So my understanding too, and you can correct me where I'm wrong, but like boys tend to be more of the predominantly hyperactive, impulsive presentation, and girls tend to be more the inattentive presentation typically. Is that correct?
Statistically, that's correct. I question whether it's actually correct because I think manifestations of hyperactivity and impulsivity are happening in girls and women, but they look different. And so they don't always get checked off on a checklist. But if you get to know women with ADHD, a lot of them will talk about prominent mental restlessness and feeling like they want to switch jobs a lot, or things like impulsive shopping. And so it may be that we just don't notice the manifestations of those symptoms. But if you looked at like epidemiological data, yes, more boys get diagnosed with the mostly the combined type than
Yeah.
girls and women would. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you find that like as we age, we get we all tend, or not everyone, but people, of course, ADHD is different in different people. And I always like making sure people understand that. But of course, it is an acronym too. Do you find that as adults with ADHD mature, or as children mature into adults, they become more combined? Is that correct in their maturity as they learn? Like, obviously, you don't have a man or a woman for that matter running around the office like a little hyperactive kid might in class in school. So you learn these coping mechanisms and ways to slow yourself down, assuming you're not diagnosed, of course, with no information. What are your thoughts on that? Have you?
So if you again, like there's one story that's told by all of the scientific data that we have, and then there might be like another story told by the people living with ADHD. So the scientific data suggests that the severity of ADHD symptoms seems to go down as people age. And the idea that we like kind of have lived under the umbrella of for what decades is that people grow out of their ADHD. But at the same time, there's also scientific data that suggests that the impairments or the functional difficulties people have in their life related to ADHD goes up as people go older because life gets more demanding. You get married, you have kids, you have to suddenly be accountable to more than just yourself. And so we see that kind of like differentiation there. Um, we see that as people, I think, as cognition develops and matures in general, like as people move through their 20s, there may be a greater being able to self manage and being on top of yourself because your brain is just sort of like, at its peak, probably in its 30s, whether you have ADHD or not, right? So you may have more cognitive resources during that time to sort of like help yourself. But then as people get older, obviously, no matter if you have ADHD or not, your cognition is going to be impacted by getting older. And so you kind of see on IQ tests too, like people peak and then they sort of decline a little bit. So interestingly, like with men, you see that decline correlate with age more. But with women, you actually see it correlate more with hormone levels than age itself. And so there is sort of like possibly sex differences in the way that people's ADHD symptoms may change and ebb and flow as they, get older and then you hit this peak where their cognition should be at its best and then start to lose slowly, like some of those cognitive like resources, I suppose.
And is it right that the prefrontal cortex has roughly a 3-year delay in development for ADHDers? Is there truth to that?
Yeah, there's some evidence to suggest that. It's really based on some studies that were done as people move from childhood to adolescence. So
Mm.
whether you can like extrapolate that to a permanent 3-year delay, in terms of entire life, that I think that's a little unknown, but I don't think that's a harmful concept to sort of endorse that like it may be the case that if you have sort of like a slower pace of brain development, then it's not that you won't get there eventually. It's that, you're sort of getting there more slowly. And since I work a lot with this sort of like high school to young adult crowd, and I work a lot with their nervous parents, I think that's a really helpful sort of framing to tell folks is like, just because somebody is really struggling now, it doesn't mean that in a few years when they just sort of have matured a little bit more cognitively that they can't kind of like be in a much better place. So not to fret over somebody's current like functioning, because we do know that ADHD waxes and wanes and there's all kinds of factors that really impact that.
What are some of the factors that affect ADHD that you found?
We've been doing research on this more recently because it's, I think, kind of an interesting topic. It's also really hard to study this, like in a really like solid research design way. Um, but I've been fortunate to be an investigator on some of these big longitudinal studies where they like identify kids when they're in childhood with ADHD and follow them at least into sort of like their through their 20s.
Mm.
And then some of that work we're finding that there may be this kind of interesting U-shaped curve between the environment and a person's ADHD severity. We've heard about U-shaped curves before, often in the context of anxiety, right? So it's good to be a little bit scared because that keeps you safe, right? But if you're way too scared, you're going to have some problems like, trusting yourself and going forward and doing things in life. Well, there might be something similar going on with ADHD and the environment. So a lot of times we talk about the demands of the environment or the structure of the environment and needing to hit like a sweet spot for people with ADHD. And we've been doing a lot of interviews with folks where we learned that if there's way too much going on, you can get cognitively overburdened, overwhelmed, and just feel like you can't function and just feel dysregulated all the time. And that's not good. But if you find yourself in a state where you don't have a lot that you're accountable to, or you don't have a lot of demands on you, that may be not good either, because you may find yourself sort of slipping into a slump of amotivation and sort of sitting on the couch and not being able to get yourself up and activating and doing things. So I think one of the pieces here for people with ADHD is sort of designing their optimal environment where they can feel like, it's not too demanding, but there's stuff that kind of interests me, excites me, and gets me moving and engaging every day. So we've been looking a lot about environmental features. In women, there's a lot of work going on right now understanding the impact of hormones on the waxing and waning of ADHD, which I think is really interesting as well. And then other things in people's lives, for example, substances, even just talking about things like caffeine and nicotine. We don't even need to be talking about illicit drugs. How people find ways to optimize and cope and self-regulate with exercise, just the little things that you figure out how to put in your day to kind of keep yourself at this equilibrium.
I've joked before that I want to become hyper-focused on exercise. How do I do that? You know what I mean? I have learned that, and I do it most days where I go for a 3-mile walk in the mornings just to plan my day, clear my head, listen to a podcast, talk to myself, whatever it is. And I know there's evidence that exercise, is especially helpful for ADHDers. Obviously, it's helpful for everybody. Mm-hmm. So that's a given, but I think it does help kind of clear the cobwebs in the morning. And also this feeling of success kicking off the day, that you've already succeeded in doing that walk that maybe you didn't feel like doing, but you got your shoes on and you went out and you did it. It is a good way, from a positive mindset way of starting the day with a success. What are some tips in helping folks, adjust or update or fix their environments in a sense, whether it's a home office like I have, whether it's an office like so many people do have, or dorm rooms for college kids?
Yeah, I think if you zoom out, the most important thing is to have a trial and error mindset.
Hi, I'm Alex Green from Little Bird. You know that feeling when you've got 47 tabs open, 3 half-written docs, a Slack thread you swore you'd come back to, an email you've been meaning to send, and your brain is doing all the heavy lifting just to keep track of any of it? That's exactly why we built Little Bird. It's an AI assistant that quietly remembers what you're working on. It builds a private memory of your screen and your meetings, so you can close all those tabs and feel okay doing it. Nothing is lost. Everything is backed up and waiting for you. When you need to find a detail, pick up where you left off, or draft an email in your voice, Little Bird is already up to speed. No catching the AI up with long prompts, no copying and pasting. Little Bird is SOC2 certified. Your data is never used to train models, and you can pause or delete it anytime. Wise Squirrels listeners get a free trial plus $20 off your first month of Little Bird Plus at wisesquirrels.com/littlebird. Give it a try. I think you'll wonder how you ever worked without it.
If you're neurodivergent, welcome. I'm George Sachs, clinical psychologist, and I have ADHD. One of the things that frustrates me the most is how ADHD is presented. Just learn some tools and you'll be fixed. In no time, you'll be super productive and organized. But when you actually live with ADHD, the issues run much deeper. It's the feeling of always being slightly out of sync with the world around you, knowing you're capable but not being able to show it consistently, watching other people move through life with what what looks like ease, wondering why you have to try so much harder to just stay afloat. Over time, that does something to how you see yourself. You start believing you're lazy, unreliable, too intense, too sensitive. This was something I saw time and time again in therapy sessions with my clients who had ADHD, and I recognized this in myself. That's why I created Inflow. Inflow isn't about fixing ADHD. It's support that actually fits how ADHD brains work, knowing what you can change and what parts of you need deep acceptance. Get the support you need with Inflow. Head to ysquirrels.com/inflow to check it out.
So you could read all of the tips and tricks out there, but only some of them are going to work for you, and everyone's different. So it's really just like about coming into it like a detective on yourself and sort of not getting demoralized if something you thought was going to work is hard to stick with. And it's a journey of sort of like figuring out what features or what structural aspects of your environment like help you do your best. And for some people, it's novelty. And so they need to learn to mix things up, you know. And for some people, it's routine. They just like to have everything the same way and less to think about, you know, just wear the same red shirt every day if that's what makes you feel like, you know, you can just sort of like be automatic with things. And getting to know yourself, because people aren't just ADHD. People are ADHD plus all their personality traits. And so really kind of understand the interaction between your ADHD and who you are. I think that self-knowledge, that self-awareness, I think can put people at ease and just sort of help them just sort of neutrally as they move through the years of their life, learn more and more about themselves and what works. And just because, you know, something that someone says should work for you doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you also.
Great point. Yeah. And there is this curse, I find, one of the biggest, or not, I mean, not compared to anxiety and depression and addiction and these really negative comorbidities that can come along for the ride. But also a challenge, at least for me, and I hear this from others, is this curse of novelty where you find the system, you find the way to do something that works. And then for some reason, your brain's like, yeah, well, I don't like that anymore. And suddenly it's like, damn it, it was working so well. It's this curse. It's like, oh man. So now you got to find the analog way to do it or the digital way to do it or some other method.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're working currently on the American Professional Society of ADHD and Related Disorders, APSARD, as the kids say.
Good work.
Hashtag APSARD. Tell me, like, because obviously there's the DSM, you know, the Bible for mental health professionals. Is this related to the DSM? Tell me how this all connects, or does it?
Yeah, so I am one of the sort of leaders of a task force that is writing adult ADHD diagnostic and treatment guidelines for the US. So basically every developed major country or region, at least in the world, has guidelines of how practitioners should diagnose and treat ADHD. And it's important for us to have guidelines because the care of ADHD is really under the purview of many types of practitioners. And because we've had such a huge demand for ADHD care in the US since basically 2020, a lot of new professionals that didn't necessarily specialize in ADHD when they got their training and in the first part of their career are kind of being forced into the fold to make sure there's enough people to take on this demand for services. Yeah. And so we're at this point where there's a lot of diversity in terms of what practitioners are doing to diagnose and treat ADHD, and some of them may be using well-established, trustworthy practices, and some may not be. And so even though there is a DSM that anyone can go read, for example, how do you diagnose ADHD, the DSM is really the what, but you really also need guidance on the how. And in ADHD, there is a lot of complexity to how you gather trustworthy, good information about a person's symptom level, about their history, how those symptoms have changed over time, about the way those symptoms interfere with their life, also about pitting the possibility of ADHD against alternatives that could also explain somebody's symptoms, because there's a lot of overlap between ADHD symptoms and other things. And if we accidentally assume ADHD, we may give someone the wrong treatment, for example.
Yeah.
So we know there's a high demand among practitioners for just like more detailed information on exactly how you make good inferences, collect good information, and feel more confident in the diagnoses that you're making. So yeah, that it's, we can't rewrite the DSM. Unfortunately, we don't have the authority to, but we're going to do our best to say, if this is the book, the document we have right now, what's the best way to basically use it and interpret it for practitioners.
And when is this document being released or published?
It doesn't have a release date yet. A lot of it is contingent upon external folks. So we've had like 3 rounds of review where we send it to either organizations or people for review. And so once we get that back from everyone and integrate their feedback, like we're in kind of the final stage of release for it. So I think the hope is that we'll see it by the end of 2026, but I think the exact month and date is not yet confirmed. So
yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's good. I'm not allowed to disclose its contents per se, but I can say a few things about it. I mean, we're really going through and trying to look at a couple perspectives. Like scientifically, we do have studies that show us which methods of diagnosing ADHD seem to pick up on the right people versus false positives versus missing people. And so we can kind of collect all that science information and put it together, collate it. It's a lot of stuff, and not everyone always looks at all of it all together. So that's one helpful piece of information. We also have like basically a panel of clinicians from different professions who can fill in the science gaps with their own like experiences for decades treating and working with people with ADHD and sharing also from their perspective what works. And then we also have sort of like this third piece where we're going to advocacy organizations, like people may have heard of CHAD or ADA, and asking them to share with their kind of like community to give feedback as well on whether or not what we're coming up with feels comfortable to from a patient's perspective or a person with ADHD's perspective.
And is the guidelines mainly for the diagnosis and treatment, or just the diagnosis?
Well, I am chairing the diagnosis section. There are 2 other sections. There's one on pharmacological treatment, and then there's one on non-pharmacological supports or treatments as well. And so
like CBT and...
Yeah, exactly. So the 3 groups kind of like are working sort of separate from each other, but there's like an overall steering committee that looks at all of their work and makes sure it integrates well, et cetera.
So I know you can't speak too much about what's in there right now. My understanding, at least, is that, well, first of all, I mean, there's so many things that I've learned that that women typically have about a 5-year delay in being diagnosed versus men. What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, so I think it's what you said is 100% true, but I think it's not like a monolithic explanation for what has happened with women. I think the other important thing to remember is that girls may have ADHD symptoms that are partially undetected because they aren't causing them any impairment until they're older. And we do diagnose based on impairment. Even if we have a girl that we have a watch on because she seems a little inattentive, if she's got friends, if she's getting along well at home, if she's getting her responsibilities done, and if her grades are decent, like we wouldn't, at least I wouldn't advocate for diagnosing that person with ADHD, because that would lead, I think, to over pathologizing a person who is doing okay in their life. Doesn't mean we're going to put a watch on that kid.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times part of the reason girls get diagnosed later is because they actually, there are been genetic studies that even find that there are protective effects of the female sex on the expression of ADHD genetic risk. So they just may not express it a little bit until later. But there are also girls who are not noticed, and that's very valid. The other piece is that I think is probably even more important here. There is a generation of adult psychiatrists that were trained to think that ADHD is something that you grow out of when you're 18, and that diagnosis is not under their purview. And that generation, I would say as recently as 10 years ago and even still today, that is being perpetuated in training programs for people studying adult psychiatry, adult clinical psychology, kind of our frontline mental health diagnosticians. And so they aren't even looking for ADHD in anyone over 18. They're not screening for it. They don't think about those symptoms as being ADHD. And so that is, from my perspective, a huge issue of just understanding how we can integrate education on adult ADHD into these adult training programs. Because the only people who really specialize in adult ADHD these days are, I'd say 90% of them had child adolescent training. That's how they got into ADHD. And then they realized, oh, this is also going on in adults and I'm inspired to help there. But you don't see a lot of the other way around. And so that's where all these anxiety and depression diagnoses come in, is that if you're 19, 20-year-old woman experiencing maladjustment in college as everything is chaos, for a lot of young adults with ADHD, and you go to an adult psychologist that's a couple blocks down from your college dorm, and you endorse general kind of a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of depression, some ADHD symptoms, you'll probably get put on an SSRI, put out the door, and unless you stumble upon an ADHD specialist, that may be what happens to you for 10 years or so.
I know with women with ADHD, my understanding is it's more, certainly from the listeners of this show too, there's many more women being diagnosed now over men. And I think my understanding at least is because ADHD is, and correct me where I'm wrong, is highly heritable, like extremely heritable, chances are they learn as their child is diagnosed, and as they start to learn about ADHD, they realize like, oh wait, I have ADHD too, or my husband does, or partner. Is that accurate?
Yeah,
you've heard.
I've been seeing that the entire time I've been practicing. So for about like 20 years or so, I've been seeing that. And I think the other one that we're seeing more of more recently is that people are seeing things on social media that's relatable, and they're saying, whoa, that sounds a lot like me, or that sounds a lot like my partner. Yeah. And I've met with many people who say that their partner showed them a TikTok video and they were kind of like, whoa, okay. So I think that right now, I think those are the two that like kind of big aha moments that we're seeing people have where they self-recognize in themselves. And that may be people who've never had any contact with the mental health system, because they've always just kind of been just they've had it together enough that it hasn't, brought them in the door to get any help.
A topic that comes up from time to time, and I really know nothing or very little about menopause for obvious reasons, being male and not a doctor. What do you know as far as ADHD symptoms and its connection to perimenopause and menopause?
So this relates to that idea earlier of like the cognitive resources of people waning as they age, or in the case of women, as your hormone levels deplete, as you go through that hormonal transition. Estrogen in particular is a neuromodulator, and so it does have an impact on dopamine levels in the brain. Mm-hmm. And so there is sort of like a direct link between levels of estrogen, or I'm not an endocrinologist, but as I understand it, the ratio between estrogen and progesterone also is part of this. And the level of dopamine available in the neurochemical environment of the brain. So, and that you also see that in the menstrual cycle too. So you can see it earlier too. And so with that relationship, obviously, I think the severity of people's cognitive symptoms can be exacerbated by having that double whammy. You also see that women without ADHD experience cognitive impacts of going through that hormonal transition as well, in some of the same areas of the brain that ADHD impacts. And so that's often a very tricky differential diagnosis for clinicians, is if you have like a 45-year-old woman coming in saying like, things have gotten worse for me, I'm feeling this way. And you have to figure out, like, is there a developmental history there? Has at least some of that symptom cluster been present kind of all along the way? And it takes that detective work. But yeah, it's like a double whammy, essentially.
And just so I'm clear, or what you're saying is that, and I really don't, my understanding at least is that for ADHDers, because for a long time I thought we lacked dopamine, but my understanding is we don't. It's the dopamine receptors who are not receiving adequate dopamine. And so from what you're saying, like if with estrogen reducing the amount of dopamine, now you've got dopamine receptors who are more challenged. This would be total amateur neurologist here. Now you don't have enough dopamine either, like making it worse. Does that make any sense?
That is a fair thing to say. It's super complex. I'm not a neurology person either. Like I understand enough of it to be a good clinician, but like yeah, there's often I think a tendency to oversimplify the neurocognitive expressions of ADHD. And I think it's okay because like we have to talk in simple terms in order to be able to exchange ideas without being neuroscientists. But yeah, the main thing is it's super complex. And as a result of this complexity, there are various things going on in the body that can impact cognition that aren't just your traditional mental health diagnoses. Endocrine going into thyroid disorders is another big one. People who have cardiovascular disease also have cognitive impacts of that. So there's all kinds of things that if you're not at ideal health, that can be impacting your cognition. And increasingly it's becoming a bigger part of sort of important differential diagnosis in adulthood, because you do want to make sure that you're understanding the source of somebody's difficulties with cognition so that you can get the right treatment. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think that's part of the reason, my understanding at least, is part of the diagnostics is looking back at their childhood and life. And yes, challenges ebb and flow, certainly for everybody. But, if the red flags were there, like, thank God my mom kept all my old report cards, which are hilarious to read the comments. And I have a lot of apology letters to send probably. If my teachers are still around. So I often tell people that if you are going to go see your doctor because you feel like you might have ADHD, a really great first question is, before even stating this, is to ask what their views are, thoughts about ADHD. So that way, if they say, oh, you grow out of it, or it's not real, or blah, blah, or it's overdiagnosed or whatever, those are all red flags to say, like, okay, it's time to find a new doctor, because they also may not believe in cancer or whatever. So I think that advice stands. And from what I've heard from other guests as well, I'm curious, unless I'm wrong on that one, feel free to chime in. But I'm curious, what are some good or bad? What are some red flags that a person can look for to protect people from a misdiagnosis or a missed diagnosis? What are some red flags that you could talk about that a person going to see their doctor about this could ask?
Yeah, I love your question. I think that's a great one. People should do that. Another question you can ask is if they are comfortable evaluating someone for ADHD in adulthood that's never been diagnosed before, what does their process of evaluation look like? If anyone is going to evaluate you in less than 30 minutes and give you a diagnosis, that's a red flag, because at least for adults, 9 times out of 10, you need to do more due diligence and learn more about a person before you can draw any conclusions. I'm not going to say 1 out of 10 times there's not this person who comes in and they're so textbook that that's fine, we got this figured out. But people are complex. And if you made it that long without being diagnosed, you're probably not that clear cut. So, I think that's important that they take their time with you. A good diagnosis also involves asking your loved ones to share about you as well. It doesn't mean that we don't trust you, that we don't think you're able to tell about yourself, but it doesn't matter if you have ADHD or not. There's a view you have of yourself and there's a view other people have of you, and you put the two together, you get the best sense of a person. And so it really does help to see the things that people notice about you that maybe you don't notice about yourself, that can put together the picture. So I think that, that they're being thorough is important. I think that in general, I like to ask people how they came to think that they have ADHD, because I think that's really important from a clinician's perspective. So I would say, if you don't feel like the clinician is, engaging in a meaningful conversation with you that's curious and interested in, where you came to like get that conclusion from, and instead they seem to be interrogating you about it, that is a huge red flag as well. Like,
Yeah.
I've definitely worked with clinicians that are sort of like, well, that person's like a really successful, like investment banker. Like, why would they have ADHD? Like, you don't want to work with someone like that, right? So just like look for those kinds of just like implicit red flags as well.
So just repeating what you said, like really in that initial consultation with a care provider, first of all, like I said, like asking what their views are about ADHD, even before saying like, I think I have ADHD, but
Mhm.
hey, I read an article about ADHD. What are your thoughts about that? Just to see what they say. I also always add that they may refer to it as ADD, and that just means they're more old school.
That doesn't turn me off. It is
No,
even some specialists in ADHD still call it that, but they know what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just the name change, which is really annoying and to
Mhm.
keep people confused. Because I hear from people like just saying like, "Oh, I think I might have ADD. I don't have ADHD because I'm not hyperactive." And I'm like, "Oh, that's so like science people. Come on,
It's so nice.
we can communicate better here." But yeah, so asking those questions, and then as you said, like if they're rushing you through a 30-minute process, that's a red flag. And then also if they're not finding more about you and your past. uh, I don't even know the answer to this. So I'm curious, like who can diagnose you? Is it your GP, maybe you're like your family doctor, right? Psychologist, psychiatrist, nurse practitioner.
I mean, there isn't like a hard it has to be a licensed healthcare practitioner at the very least. Okay. So that could involve a wide range of people. There isn't like this there aren't really turf wars about who's allowed to diagnose and who's not. Like basically you should use your own judgment. Like do you have enough competence, to diagnose people? You will see that's sort of like the traditional people diagnosing for many, many decades has been psychologists and psychiatrists. But as there haven't been enough of those to go around,
Mm.
we saw a movement into primary care maybe the last 10, 15 years, because often they're providing prescriptions anyways. Now we're seeing an even broader movement into nurse practitioners from MDs. On the psychosocial side, we're seeing social workers, mental health counselors who've gotten enough training that they're feeling confident making those diagnoses. So e- even people like occupational therapists may be making diagnoses. I think part of the thing is that we have to affix that diagnosis to bill for services. And so if you haven't received one previous, but you're receiving services for something that is basically ADHD symptoms, like that person's in a position where they either have to make the diagnosis to bill or they have to ask you to get it from somewhere else. And I think increasingly people are just like feeling more comfortable making that diagnosis because
Mm.
there is starting to be better education on what it all ADHD looks like.
You mentioned earlier about self-diagnosis or about people seeing stuff on TikTok. What's the stuff that you've seen that's most incorrect?
Well, first of all, as a caveat, I don't have TikTok. I don't go on TikTok, but I do like kind of see things and people
Wait, you're a mental health professional and you don't have TikTok?
out. I like love the
That's like,
idea of staying under a rock and staying off social media, but
no, it's like a cancer doctor like smoking cigarettes. It's like, honey,
right.
God, what is wrong?
Yeah,
Something
yeah,
is wrong here. Sorry.
totally fair. Yeah, but I think I think the issue at hand here is that the average American on several studies has 2 or 3 symptoms of ADHD. So it's not that people are producing content that's wildly inaccurate about ADHD, but for me the biggest issue is that like just because one symptom of ADHD is relatable does not mean you have ADHD. You have to have a robust cluster of those symptoms for most of your life that is debilitating to really qualify for the diagnosis. So I think the issue with TikTok has been there is a piece of ADHD that is relatable to probably everyone out there, and that people are making this like inference that because this really engaging, funny, interesting content it like hits home that like, oh no, I have ADHD. I think there are some um mythologize symptoms of ADHD that may be true, but that just don't have scientific backing yet. And so people like me who are, trusted to stay within the science, like can't go out on such a limb to say like, yes, this is definitely a symptom of ADHD or no, it's not. But it doesn't mean that a person with ADHD isn't genuinely experiencing that symptom. I just can't say for sure whether that is a core part of their ADHD or a part of their personality or a part of a comorbidity they have. And so, and some examples like with that would be like rejection sensitivity. Like, I think that's something that people experience. Like it also comes a lot from the social anxiety world. They've had that concept for a long time. And so I think like for me, it's like, I don't know whether that is a comorbidity related to social anxiety that happens to be a version of social anxiety that a lot of people with ADHD experience, or whether that is actually a core psychological impairment of ADHD that's unrelated to having comorbid anxiety. And the reason for that is because no one's done a research study on that. And that nuance is important. Like, I have a colleague who's starting to do work on that, and she's doing EEG research in the brain, right, where they're measuring electrical signals in the brain to see if the actual like neural transmission that is associated with ADHD is firing differently in social paradigms that might elicit rejection sensitivity. And if the answer is yes, then it probably is part of like the core of ADHD. But if the answer is no, it's really only present in people with anxiety, then it's just like a flavor of a co-occurring condition. And so I think that's the kind of thing that TikTok can't put into like a 30-second video.
Well, and also if you're spending time on TikTok or social media, I mean, like Jonathan Haidt's book, which is, The Anxious Generation, I think, and having, a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old myself, and also being sort of an early adopter in a lot of social before I all went evil. I find that like RSD, and I know my understanding is rejection sensitivity disorder is not even part of the DSM or not in there at this point anyway, but because to your point, like it hasn't been researched enough perhaps, but that is, I mean, I think everybody feels if you're swiping for dates, like RSD is going to be like the symptoms of rejection are going to be there, or somebody doesn't show up for a date, or you don't get the job you hope for, or you're not hearing back from any jobs you're applying to now because the HR department's using AI and the applicants are using AI. And really, we're all just hoping AI chooses us until it destroys everything. But although there are probably, are you guys doing anything with because I could see that obviously there's a lot of good with AI putting away, the ending of humanity, but putting that aside for a second, and the data centers, it could make the case for AI where when you release these findings of helping, clinicians detect or diagnose ADHD, there could be sort of a choose your own adventure for the clinician to go through each of the steps that you've created with a patient in order to then help them diagnose, right? Does that make sense?
Like having an AI tool that helped with clinical decision making?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I know they already exist, but yeah.
If the AI was good enough, in the future, that could be something to look at. I think the consequences of the AI getting it wrong are very high.
Yeah.
And so I would see it being more of an aid than an actual decision-making tool. We have issues with AI hallucinating things, and we've played with AI in some of our work with ADHD, and it does. And so the issue there is, think about the misdiagnosed woman with ADHD, right? The consequences of somebody not being able to dig deeper and understand. Algorithmizing somebody is probably exactly what's going to put those people at risk. So, yeah, I think it could be in the future, but I would personally, I would be hesitant to take the human connection out of the diagnostic encounter.
Oh, yeah.
That's for me. Like, I think when you really get to know somebody, you can see things that are unsaid sometimes. And maybe AI will get that smart, but I don't think it's that smart yet.
Yeah, and actually, yeah. And just to be clear, I'm not suggesting just using that. Like a clinician using something like that to process the information. But I suppose, like, I have an ADHD assessment at ysquirrels.com on the website with full disclosure, and very clearly it states that, like, and it's a link to the American Mental Health Association's online assessment. So it's that one. I don't see the results, of course, but I always say very clearly that you can use that online assessment as a starting point. But even if it comes back and says you probably don't have ADHD, and you're doing the assessment for a reason, you should still speak with your healthcare provider regardless. Like, don't just take that verbatim, right?
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
You could almost take that, but what you're cutting out the AI thing, you could create a tool that just is like a survey based that a clinician could use. Look at me like explaining.
Yeah, no, they exist. Yeah, they exist.
Yeah.
And, the big thing about diagnosing ADHD and looking for new symptoms of ADHD and how do we do a better job finding people who are usually missed is, like, you have to find these symptoms that both what we call sensitivity and specificity. So what that means is that they have to both be able to ring true to people with ADHD and have most people with ADHD say yes to them. But then also you have to make sure that the rest of the world isn't also saying yes to them. So, like, a perfect example of this is I have trouble getting myself to do things when I really hate this task. That sounds really true for people with ADHD, right? Like, that's a very core experience for them. But also 70% of the population says yes to that. So although it's a core experience of a person with ADHD, it's not a good diagnostic symptom because it doesn't help us tell the difference. And so we're looking for these symptoms, and we have to do a lot of mathematical analyses on different options for symptoms that are both the core experience of people with ADHD and not the core experience of the everyday person who doesn't have ADHD. And some of those can be tricky to find. And so that's why the work of, like, just integrating any symptom that somebody brings up on TikTok and saying, like, okay, the ADHD community feels really strongly about this. It can't just stop there, because then we have to test it with different groups of people. And it's not just testing it with the general population. You've got to test it with the people who often mimic ADHD. So, like, for example, there are studies where they test these candidate symptoms against people who have other prominent impulsivity, like people with gambling disorder or borderline personality disorder, or they test it with people who have high depression. And if it can differentiate, those are the real clinical dilemmas that we are faced with. Like, is this person just depressed or they have ADHD? Like, if it can differentiate those people, those are strong symptoms. So there is, like, as much as I am psyched about the new ideas coming off of social media, like, there is a part 2 where we have to do the science to figure out which ones functionally help medical or healthcare providers make sound decisions as well.
Yeah, because I think, and my understanding too from Russell Barkley is with, undiagnosed and untreated ADHD, your life expectancy can be up to 13 years less. And that is because of things like addiction, like excess or impulsivity, driving too quickly and crashing, or getting diabetes from eating too much or junk food, or the impulsivity associated with stuff like that. And so helping to solve, it's got to be challenging because, and with those comorbidities, because for some of the stuff I follow from what he's talked about in the past about, like, if you're not treating the root cause, my understanding is ADHD. I mean, if you have clinical depression, it doesn't mean you have ADHD, like we're talking about. But if you have ADHD, there's a high likeliness you probably have a comorbidity like depression or anxiety, certainly. And so if you're only treating the depression, you're not treating the root. I use air quotes on cause, but like sort of that thing in the background that's helping to drive that depression. And thus you're not going to effectively treat that depression because you're not recognizing and treating the ADHD. Is that right?
Yeah. And this goes back to, like, I mean, any clinician that isn't saying this is not being honest with you. It is so hard sometimes to do the differential diagnosis because there's 3 possibilities. It could just be ADHD. It could be that it's depression that just looks like ADHD, or it could be a person with ADHD who also has depression. And you have to just, like, figure out, like, does that ADHD have a life outside this depressive episode? Was it there before this depressive episode? Is it worse during this depressive episode? Another tough one is folks who smoke a lot of marijuana. They come in, they've been doing it their whole adult life. And you're like, did this ADHD predate this heavy use of marijuana? Because, there's cognitive impacts if you are a heavy smoker of weed. So those are the types of tricky things that are very hard for us. We do our best with them. Even the people with the most knowledge often walk out not 100% confident. So if if the practitioner is not taking enough time with you, especially if you are a complex presentation like that, to figure out what's going on with you, that is exactly the red flag we talked about earlier. It can take hours of getting to know people to really try to, make a good conclusion.
And do you think part of the process then, once this report or this study comes out or these findings are released that you're working on, that's probably a good question too for your medical provider, right? Is are you familiar with APSARD or the findings from APSARD? Do you say APSARD? Is that right?
APSARD, yeah, you got it. Yeah, so this is the big professional organization for any healthcare provider from any discipline that's interested in specializing in ADHD. So that is a multidisciplinary group, and those guidelines are going to be public. It's something that a person who has ADHD and is not a medical professional can get and look at and read. And, they can ask themselves, is the person that's treating me or diagnosing me following these steps? That it should create transparency, I think, from the patient side as well,
That's great. I'm keeping an eye on the time here because I know we're going to hard stop. But are there questions I haven't asked you about this, or do you have questions for me about ADHD or about the journey or what have you? Or
yeah, I think it'd be cool to hear you talk about from your experience, what would you want us to know, as people who are trying to improve the diagnostic system in this country for people with ADHD? What do you think practitioners might be missing?
It's a great question. Are there tips for maybe people that are, whether not necessarily low income, but certainly people that don't have the resources financially, or, are there tips or ideas you have for folks or who don't have the adequate insurance or insurance at all? Obviously, you're going to need to be diagnosed in order to receive the psychological treatment or the medication and so on. It's a big question, but are there, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think something that's important to my task force and me is making sure that we're keeping ADHD evaluations as affordable as possible while being as thorough as possible. Because obviously there are fancy schmancy ADHD evaluations that people can get that cost $6,000 that give you a 30-page report on your brain. And you really don't need that to know if someone has ADHD or not. And so for us, keeping the standard is what is sufficient and needed, but no more is important. And primary care settings are probably the most affordable way to get an ADHD diagnosis, for a person who maybe has limited health coverage. Primary care offices can spend just as much time with you, but they have to do it over multiple short visits. And there's nothing wrong with that. So you probably want to look for, if you're getting new insurance, or, if you even if you're uninsured and you're just trying to figure out what clinic can I go to for as needed care, try to find someone where they have experience with ADHD, or they say in their profile that they also have interest in behavioral health as a part of their expertise, because that's the kind of provider that hopefully can do more in-house for you than having to send you off to specialty care, which is where get more expensive. So I'd say take time with choosing who you're going to primary care with. Don't be careful with the online startups that have mostly been shut down now. But we had a model during the pandemic that people may know the federal government really cracked down on and made some indictments on, where you basically filled out an online survey. It's super cheap. You met with a practitioner for 5 minutes. They gave you a prescription, and that there's a cheapness in that that's tempting, but there's a danger in that they may misdiagnose you. They may not give you the correct medication for you, and then you may be in a worse off situation psychiatrically than before you went. So it's risky.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was Dose that was shut down and charged. I believe that was the name. As far as collaborating with other organizations, being Canadian or Canarican now, uh, does AppStar share findings and information with other health bodies, the NHS and the UK and others, to help you get a consensus? Because obviously this is ADHD isn't an American thing. The A
Right.
is not for American. All humans, hunter gatherers. Come on, hunter gatherers. If it wasn't for us, I'm curious about whether you're working with other bodies to help kind of study this, and then also um, any thoughts on? I know like some Asian countries have banned stimulants and things. So like a person with ADHD traveling to, I think, Japan, you can't bring stimulants. They're outlawed there. Any thoughts? I just give you a whole bunch of stuff with like a couple minutes.
Yeah. So there's a World Federation on ADHD, which is like all of it has it's an umbrella organization for all the regional organizations like ABSARD, and there's CADRA in Canada. And we have the Australian ADHD organization is the one that we've been working most closely with because they put out their guidelines in 2023. So they're the most recent group to do the whole literature review and the process. So we've been working really closely with them because they're in time closest to us in doing this. And the UK group under the NICE guidelines, they have a pretty comprehensive guideline. So on our task force, we have Europeans, folks from Canada, folks from Australia who've sort of been involved in the other regional efforts who are kind of like helping us. And we've also had a review by people who were on the original DSM-5 committee that wrote the criteria for ADHD. So we do have sort of like these connections with people who've been through this and done this before to keep sort of everyone talking with each other. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the politics behind the countries that are outlawing or banning stimulant medications. But it does highlight the fact that there is just like really cultural differences in the way ADHD is viewed and its treatment is viewed. I think, something like the World Federation of ADHD has value because it brings people every 2 years together from all over the world to kind of have these discussions and make sure we're not siloed when we're, dealing with the policy implications of ADHD in our individual countries.
Yeah, no, that's great. Maggie, man, this has been so great. How can people get a hold of you and learn more about what you do?
I have a website. It's margaretsibley.com. I think for my engagement with folks, the best thing is that we have a big research participant pool that you can find on my website by hitting that you want to participate in research. And we do interviews with folks with ADHD who want to tell us about their lived experience. We show you experimental treatments and get your feedback on it. So we have like a real kind of cool back and forth with the ADHD community. So if anyone thinks that speaks to them, feel free to sign up to be in our participant pool. But other than that, I kind of hide off of social media. So the best way to get in touch with me is send me a message through my website, margaretsibley.com. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed the show today, please leave a rating and review. This helps other wise squirrels discover the show and reminds me to keep doing this. Do you have questions or comments? Want to share an audio comment or question? Do you have questions about joining the nest? Or are you interested in a free coaching session with me? Just visit wisesquirrels.com for details. Support of the podcast comes from our generous sponsors, our guests, and you. Thank you for being here. Without you, I'd be talking to myself, and that's no fun. Hosting for Wise Squirrels is provided by our friends at the Marketing Podcast Network at marketingpodcast.net. You'll find special event invitations, links, show notes, free resources, and a whole bunch more at wisesquirrels.com. And while you're there, sign up for the newsletter. That way you'll never miss another episode. We'll see you soon. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm Alex Green from Little Bird. You know that feeling when you've got 47 tabs open, 3 half-written docs, a Slack thread you swore you'd come back to, an email you've been meaning to send, and your brain is doing all the heavy lifting just to keep track of any of it? That's exactly why we built Little Bird. It's an AI assistant that quietly remembers what you're working on. It builds a private memory of your screen and your meetings, so you can close all those tabs and feel okay doing it. Nothing is lost, everything is backed up and waiting for you. When you need to find a detail, pick up where you left off, or draft an email in your voice, Littlebird is already up to speed. No catching the AI up with long prompts, no copying and pasting. Littlebird is SOC2 certified. Your data is never used to train models, and you can pause or delete it anytime. Wise Squirrels listeners get a free trial plus $20 off your first month of Littlebird Plus at wisesquirrels.com/littlebird. Give it a try. I think you'll wonder how you ever worked without it.
If you're neurodivergent, welcome. I'm George Sachs, clinical psychologist, and I have ADHD. One of the things that frustrates me the most is how ADHD is presented. Just learn some tools and you'll be fixed. In no time, you'll be super productive and organized. But when you actually live with ADHD, the issues run much deeper. It's the feeling of always being slightly out of sync with the world around you, knowing you're capable but not being able to show it consistently, watching other people move through life with what looks like ease, wondering why you have to try so much harder to just stay afloat. Over time, that does something to how you see yourself. You start believing you're lazy, unreliable, too intense, too sensitive. This was something I saw time and time again in therapy sessions with my clients who had ADHD, and I recognized this in myself. That's why I created Inflow. Inflow isn't about fixing ADHD. It's support that actually fits how ADHD brains work, knowing what you can change and what parts of you need deep acceptance. Get the support you need with Inflow. Head to wisesquirrels.com/inflow to check it out.